Thanks for joining us. This is Education Insight, and I'm Lacey Kendall. Over the past year, we've seen one traumatic weather incident after another. Wildfires in the Amazon rainforest, flood-related deaths in Pakistan, Hurricane Helene in Florida, followed by snow on the beaches of Florida, and our own California wildfires, charged by the kinds of wind that Los Angeles has never seen. But think about this: the scientists and experts who will help our country predict, manage, and survive exactly those kinds of catastrophes over the next 20 years are either in or about to enter college. Our guest today says our colleges and universities aren't educating students to become the types of experts we need. Her latest book is Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All. Dr. Jennie Stevens is a Caltech and Harvard University graduate who's been quoted or featured in the New York Times, Associated Press, Time, NPR, and now our show. Dr. Stevens, thanks for joining us on Education Insight.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah. In a recent article published by Harvard University, you claimed that our colleges and universities are ill-prepared, or at least not proficiently preparing students for the work of helping Americans handle, reduce, and continue to exist with climate change in the very near future. I was wondering if you could briefly explain where you see our shortcomings.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I've been working on climate and energy issues for my whole career in academia, so over 30 years now. And, at the beginning, I thought higher education institutions had a lot of potential to really have a big impact in helping us as a society figure out how to transition away from fossil fuels and move toward a more sustainable, regenerative economy. But now, 30 years later, what it seems to be is that our universities are kind of reinforcing a lot of complacency and kind of reinforcing the status quo in a way, and not really teaching us or preparing us collectively for the disruptive time that we're now living through, and also thinking more transformatively about how we could change our whole system and structures so that we were in a better position to think about brighter futures for everyone.
Well, I want to look at both of those. So I'm going to ask you here in just a moment about what we need to do to start going in the right direction. But to start off on a good foot here so people don't feel overwhelmed by what always is the conversation when you're talking about climate change, let's talk about, for a second, hopeful opportunities. For most Californians right now, in this week and in this moment, with our recent California fire tragedies and the increasing size of hurricanes in the south, it seems daunting to imagine things getting worse. So how much impact can our actions realistically have in reducing current and future climate change threats based on what we know?
What I encourage us to think about is a climate justice lens rather than a typical climate mitigation, greenhouse gas emission reduction lens. So what I mean by a climate justice lens is acknowledging that climate change is not the problem. It's actually a symptom of a much bigger structural challenge that we have with how our economy keeps concentrating wealth and power, and the powerful interests have been obstructing climate action for so long, and it's continuing to happen, and it's actually getting worse. So we can't just keep hammering in home the same messages. Oh, we need to reduce, reuse, recycle. We need to think about individual actions. We're past the time of individual incremental change. What we need now is collective action and systemic and structural changes. And that's what climate justice, in my view, is all about. It's about this bigger picture, connecting climate to the economic system that we have, to the housing crises that we are facing in our communities, to energy system change that is essential, and investments in the public good and what communities need, not investments so that profit-seeking companies can concentrate their wealth even more than they already have. So, in thinking about how we can all engage, I think it's the collective action rather than individual action is where we are at this point. And so getting involved in our communities and advocating for bigger changes is really essential, and where we are at this point. In addition to, of course, we can all make individual and household level changes, but we really need to be working for that collective action as well.
Not just here in the U.S., but around the world.
Absolutely.
So, Doctor, how might colleges in California and in the U.S. more effectively integrate this climate justice into our existing curricula, particularly in fields that are not generally science-focused, like business, engineering, and social sciences?
Yeah, so when I first started studying climate and environmental issues back in the 90s, it was mostly science, right, where these courses were. So I got my degree in environmental science and engineering, quite technical. But what I've learned throughout my career is it's actually the social science, the cultural change, the economic restructuring and reclaiming of the public good that is what's needed, in addition to the technology changes. So I think we've been focusing too much, and in our universities, this is reinforced, on the science of climate change. And we know a lot about the science, but the science has not been informing our policies. So there's a gap there. And a lot of that gap, I think, is in the social science, in the humanities, in cultural and economic issues. And so that's the opportunity for colleges and universities in California and around the country to really think about how to introduce students to alternative visions and possibilities. We don't have to just accept this is the way the world is. So 2 ideas that I promote in my book are unlearning. We actually need to unlearn some frameworks and assumptions that we just think, like the economic growth model continuing forever. We know that that's totally incompatible with earth science and planetary boundaries and how the earth systems work. So why are we continuing to teach students an economic model as if that's the only way? There are other ways that we could be structuring our economy that would be more regenerative. And so we kind of need to unlearn some of the things that we assume is just a given. And I think our higher education institutions are reinforcing some of that. And then the other thing is this idea of exnovation. So we study a lot about innovation, right? New things, new ideas, new tools, new processes, but we don't study as much and focus as much in our universities about how to stop doing the things we know that are no longer serving us. And that's what the idea of exnovation is. So I think universities really could open up both their research and their teaching programs to think about how would we stop relying on fossil fuels? What kind of programs and initiatives and investments would we need if we genuinely wanted to move away from plastic pollution? Plastics are not only microplastics in the ocean, but they're now in our bloodstream. They're in babies' breast milk. But we don't have a program on exnovating away from plastics. So these are some of the ideas that I think we can try to encourage. And our higher education institutions are places that should and could be really central nodes for this kind of imagining alternatives. But sometimes, in many of our universities, we've been kind of constrained by financial interests and political restrictions and different things that are emerging.
Yeah, I want to address the different things that are emerging, as you say. We have a lot going on in the U.S. right now. We have a new president and administration. We have very recently exited the Paris Climate Agreement, and there are plans to double fossil fuel production. So given the new political landscape, what do you want to say to universities and communities that want to foster impactful climate action, but are very aware of those setbacks? What do you say to them?
Yeah, well, I think students and all of us can see the cognitive dissonance, between what's happening in the world in terms of more frequent and extreme weather events, the fires, floods, big storms, sea level rise. It's happening, right? And everybody is dealing with the implications of that. And so people need to know and people need to be prepared. So I don't think we can pretend that it's not an issue and that the United States and every country and community around the world does need to prepare for more extreme climate disruptions of all kinds. Obviously, we're in a political landscape that is very hostile to many of those ideas, but that doesn't mean they're going to go away, right? They're still there and we're still going to be having to deal with them. So we have to be honest and genuine with our students and with ourselves and with our institutions. And, exactly how that manifests is we're all still figuring it out, I think. But it is a very disruptive time and an uncertain time. But I think we have to keep a long-term vision for what's best for our communities and for humanity in the longer term.
If you just joined us, you're listening to Education Insight. Our guest is Dr. Jennie Stevens. She is the author of Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All. Dr. Stevens, what should our universities be doing right now to better address climate justice and ensure that all of our students understand the impact of climate change on our communities?
So climate justice is a transformative way of looking at the climate crisis. It's not just narrowly thinking about emission reductions, but it's recognizing that climate change is impacting every part of humanity. It's impacting our food systems, our housing, our transportation, our agriculture systems. And climate justice is about this integration. And one thing that we've lost in our universities oftentimes is the relational knowledge that's kind of indigenous knowledge, values very much relational, how we're all interconnected with each other and how humans are interconnected with the more than human world and all of Earth's systems. So I think that's a place where universities have an opportunity to really reintegrate relational knowledge into every program, discipline, initiative, and also connecting locally in communities in global solidarity, right? Because I think as the climate crisis is demonstrating, there's no community around the world that is not experiencing climate disruptions, but some are experiencing it more than others, and many in the global south who have not contributed to the problem as much are really experiencing it most acutely. So there is a relational piece there in terms of acting locally, focusing on our own regions and places, while also expanding the sense of global solidarity with humans and communities around the world. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for universities to engage in new ways in that capacity.
Dr. Jennie Stevens is our guest. She's the author of Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All. And we'll have more of our conversation in just a moment. This is Education Insight. Welcome back to Education Insight. I'm Lacey Kendall. Dr. Jennie Stevens is the author of the book Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All. Her book outlines how colleges and universities are falling short in creating graduates with the skills we need to help us negotiate and survive catastrophic weather incidents over the next few decades. I want to go back just a bit. We talked about bringing the climate discussion outside of science into other disciplines and the importance of that. But in colleges and universities, I'm sure you've heard this, generally each discipline operates so independently of others. How do we change that? Have you seen campuses do it?
Yeah, I think a lot of places are trying to break down and promote interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. But the importance of it is really illustrated in an example that I often talk about. A student of mine came to me at the end of the semester to say what a great course I'd taught. It was an energy course on energy and climate justice, but it was from the social and political and cultural perspective. And he was an engineer, so he'd only taken courses with very technical framing. When he came to me at the end of the semester and he said, "Thank you so much. It was a great course. At the beginning of the semester, I was a fish swimming in a fishbowl. And now I feel like I'm a fish swimming in the ocean," which is, no going back, right?
Yeah, right.
And that's what this interdisciplinarity is, and kind of the unlearning that needs to go on from breaking out of the silos, because we teach so much you become an expert in this area and you're just swimming around and around in your fishbowl. And, you need to get out and see what those connections are. And I think that's what is really a critical part of all of this. But it's hard because universities are structured in these traditional ways that have kind of canon of knowledge that everyone's supposed to learn in a certain area. Then, that takes up a lot of time to learn that. And then you miss a lot of things. So there are new ways of thinking about restructuring the learning and the unlearning that goes on in our education systems.
Have you seen successful examples of partnerships that have evolved between universities and their local communities addressing climate justice specifically?
One specific example that I talk about in my book is after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, a coalition of universities in different parts of the United States partnered with people from the universities in Puerto Rico that were displaced and kind of created a transboundary support network for people. And this, we've called it I'm part of it, the RISE network. And we, created partly virtual support, but some very practical supports for each other. And, a lot of people in Puerto Rico had to move and haven't been able to return. And the infrastructure in Puerto Rico continues to really struggle in terms of the energy system and so much else because of kind of this colonial relationship with the rest of the United States. So, that's just one example, but there are many examples. And I think one of the ideas that I think some of us are trying to promote is, what if our higher education institutions were thought of more like public libraries? We all kind of value and understand having a publicly accessible library where there's resources, where people can go to find out things and to get help with certain things that they need. What if our universities were structured maybe geographically more distributed, but also structured in a different way so that it isn't only this very cumbersome application process for people to get into a university? What if there were more community focused and community engaged teaching and learning of people at all different levels of lifelong learning, right? And so I think there's more and more discussion and examples of this happening in small amounts in many places. But I think we have the opportunity to kind of question, should we and could we kind of be reinvesting in our public education system as part of our collective response to more disruptions of all kinds? Because we could think about our higher education institutions as critical social infrastructure that could be leveraged in times of crisis for distributing resources and providing places for people to come, because often there's building space, there's other kinds of spaces available. So, these are just some of the ideas of different kinds of partnerships with universities and communities in the future.
Dr. Stevens, in our region here of the Inland Empire of Southern California, we have as many as 30 universities and colleges just in our own backyard here. And these folks listen to Education Insight. For those that are and are wondering how they could replicate and scale those kinds of efforts, where do they start? What do you want them to hear?
I think one thing that people in universities and colleges locally in California and other places can do is think about how to shift the kinds of things that they're doing already in their universities and make them more locally connected, I guess. And I think we all have more opportunities for change and empowering ourselves in our existing places and institutions than we think sometimes. So there are things many of us, both students and administrators and teachers and professors, can do to orient the teaching and learning and research that's going on toward the kind of emergent needs of climate justice and kind of the principles of thinking about vulnerable communities and how to better connect with and partner with in different ways. And then the other piece, which I think some of us are also getting involved in, it is kind of the education policy questions, right? That are beyond what any specific higher education institution can do, but thinking about at the state level, at the federal level, at the international level, how can the whole higher education sector be kind of reimagined as a resource for society in this disruptive time that we're in new and different ways. You know, what we know for sure is that things are not going to stay the same. And we are in a very turbulent time with a lot of different kinds of disruptions. And how can our higher education institutions be leveraged for change and for the public good and to better meet the needs of communities? And I think that kind of different framing of what's possible opens up different conversations and potentially different funding justifications and public investment in higher education.
It sounds to me like the greatest launching pad for this kind of change would be students learning to engage in influential policymaking at local, state, and federal levels. It seems like that will help us, regardless of politics, become more prepared and more safe if we begin to train our students and project our graduates in that direction in large scale.
Absolutely. I think that you summed it up very well. And I think, empowering students is one of the most important things we all can do or empowering ourselves, right? In this time, what's dangerous is complacency and also, obviously, the anxiety and mental health issues that come with thinking about a dystopian, worsening future. The countermeasure for that is getting involved, being empowered, engaging, collective action, joining community organizations, getting involved in policy advocacy at different levels, and being active and aware that each of our voices and our advocacy does matter. And even though a lot of powerful interests don't want us to speak up or to speak out or to advocate for different changes and different needs, but I think especially in higher education institutions, this is a place where we can nurture civic engagement. And I think it's so important in so many levels. That's something that I try to do with my students is really empower, having more active, engaged semester-long projects with community organizations, for example, and just trying to demonstrate and support students in figuring out how and in what ways they can get involved and be empowered and influence policy. And there's so many mechanisms to have an influence. There's place for everyone.
Yeah. We need to start ringing bells in not only the science department, but in the poli-sci and in business administration, in various other buildings on that college or university campus.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I sometimes use this phrase, resist, reclaim, and restructure. So what that means is, within the university context, there's some things that we're doing in our higher education institutions that some of us think, we should stop doing. And there are different opportunities in our careers, in our lives, in what phase in our educational journey we're on, where you can resist and say, no, I don't want to do it that way, or I don't want to follow along that path. But then we also have the opportunity to reclaim the public good mission of our higher education institutions. Increasingly, wealthy private sector interests and corporate interests are influencing what happens in our higher education institutions. And we can reclaim the public good mission and move away from the profit-seeking interests of private sector actors and really try to restructure higher education and reclaim it as a sector for the public good. And I think that is the piece that resonates with a lot of people, because people are recognizing sometimes increasingly how external actors are having an influence in our higher education institutions, and often with a profit-seeking motive.
On the telephone, Dr. Jennie Stevens, the author of Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All. Dr. Stevens, thank you so much for taking our call here this morning and joining us on Education Insight.
Thank you for having me.
Big congratulations going out to Redlands High School's mock trial team. They won the San Bernardino County Championship recently. The event took place at the San Bernardino Justice Center with 23 teams competing. The Terriers now advance to the state competition in March, and we'll be rooting for them. And that's our show. Join us again next week for another Education Insight. I'm Lacey Kendall. Until then, have a great week.
Hi, this is Jacob Poor, Executive Producer of Education Insight. Thank you for listening to the program. Do you have any suggestions for stories we should be covering? Are you aware of problems in local education that we should be looking at, or amazing students or educators we should be honoring? Write to us at info@inlandempiregia.org. That's info@inlandempiregia.org. Thank you for your suggestions so far. We appreciate your insight.
Education Insight is produced in partnership with KVCR San Bernardino.
Our executive producer is Jacob Poor.
And our production engineer is Tyler Veazey.
Alyssa Silva is our production assistant.
And Lacey Kendall is your host. Support is provided by College Futures Foundation.
Growing Inland Achievement. Working together for inland education and economic success.
Join us again next week for Education Insight.